Hello again to everyone. In this last chapter of the textbook, we will cover the topic of marketing ethics as applicable to travel and tourism, hospitality, and events. And this chapter starts with a general orientation on what are those best practices that are recommended for conducting ethical marketing. Let's put it that way. And here you see on the screen the most common recommendations, and they are mostly for the communication part, for the promotional activities that marketers engage in. And this have to do, of course, with being fair with our audience in our communications, being transparent, not lie to customers or not make promises that are not realistic or that we are not going to fulfill, right? Being transparent in terms of disclosing all the required information, for example, in terms of pricing, protect the privacy of consumers, of course, comply with the applicable regulations, laws, whatever rule, depending on the place where we are at. Now, there are situations in which there are no clear guidelines, or, for instance, companies where there are no codes of conduct or ethical guidelines or policies. So in those cases, it's necessary to analyze and pursue some decision-making approach that help us to have ethical outcomes. So we may be in a firm that doesn't have guidelines, or our supervisors or directors or managers do not have these clear rules as of what to do when there are ethical dilemmas. And here you have on your screen 3 of the most well-known approaches in the literature for ethical decision-making and guidance. So make sure to take a look to this because it'll be used for this week's assignment. Now, this is something that relates to promotional activities, communication, in marketing, but there are some situations in which there are issues, there are dilemmas, there are problems that escape the scope of communications and marketing to consumers. For example, in tourism activities, as we have seen in previous weeks, there are numerous stakeholders, there are several interested parties that are involved in destinations or in distribution channels in travel and tourism. And therefore, you may have contradicting or imbalanced interests. So it is often difficult to find a smooth way of serving customers, but also complying with ethical and sustainable criteria. So for one of the most common manifestations of these potential negative issues are those impacts on communities where tourism and hospitality and events take place, right, on the destinations. How are people who live in a community affected by tourism activities? Well, there are, based on the supplemental reading by Gursoy 2022, there are Cost and benefits. Of course, tourism activities bring positive outcomes, but they also come with costs, and this may be sociocultural, economic, and or environmental, as you see on the screen. And one of the models for understanding the reactions or the degree of support of residents for tourism activities is mentioned by Gursoy, the irritation index. And this is another supplemental reading. It's an encyclopedia entry that I included for this week by Pavlik and Portolan, 2015. And they very briefly go over the 4 stages in which communities and residents at destinations go through. First, through a stage of euphoria when tourism starts and develops an economy and brings benefits to people and employment. But then another stage is apathy once that the hype for tourism growth passes. And then it's possible that you have irritation when the problems and issues that accompany tourism and hospitality activities are manifested into the life of residents, and to the extreme that it may be a stage of antagonism. So this is a simple general model. There are more recent, refined frameworks, but this is a good start for you to understand this phenomenon of residents' perception as support or rejection for tourism impacts. Now, the question is how to address these possible issues at communities and destinations. Well, the other supplemental reading is by Albrecht and Cates, 2017, and this framework is what you see on your screen. Is a discussion about who are the different stakeholders who have a role or can weigh into exploring solutions, maybe not just the public entities and government, but also, of course, the private enterprises, the private sector, not only at the local or regional level, but maybe at the national or international level. So make sure to look at these readings that are supplemental to chapter 12. And that will be helpful one more time for the assignment that you have to do this week. Thank you.